Charles Kaplan holds a PhD in psychology from Columbia University. He is a student of flamenco guitar, a member of Sulam Jewish World Music Ensemble, a prayer leader at 2 synagogues, and in his free time, he's a child psychologist in private practice. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you all so much for being here this evening. Music speaks directly to our deepest selves, touching emotions, raising and relaxing energy levels, and inspiring imaginations. Adding poetry to music provides a voice for people's deepest longings, for love, for human harmony, and for a better world defined by social justice and freedom from oppression. Music's potential for social change was noted centuries ago by Plato, who wrote, "Music is a thing to beware of, as it endangers the whole fabric of society, whose most important conventions are unsettled by any revolution in that quarter." Wow. It's said that music is the universal language through which people of diverse cultural backgrounds are able to appreciate, understand, and communicate with one another, even finding common cause politically and socially. For example, just think about how the world music phenomenon that started in the 1960s has encouraged musicians and listeners to learn about others through their musical styles, their rhythms, their scales, their languages. Cross-cultural musical events are now common, with the express purpose of creating closer ties between diverse communities, promoting dialogue, deconstructing conflicts, and encouraging people to live together peacefully. This evening, I want to explore a different kind of activism through music, one that can arise when cultures share a history of oppression, exclusion, and exile. In this situation, there is a quiet empathizing and a solidarity that gets communicated through the mingling of musical styles. The poetry of songs holds the history of oppression, touching listeners on a deep emotional level. In medieval Spain, several musical cultures came together in just this kind of traumatic setting. The focus of this talk is on flamenco musical culture of the Gitanos of Spain and the music of the Sephardim, the Jewish people with deep historical ties to Spain. But the musical culture of the Muslim world, with its unique modes and rhythms, is also in the mix. All three of these musical cultures speak deeply to me, even though actually I don't belong to any of them. I like to say that my own Jewish ancestry places me solidly within the Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish subculture, but my soul finds its expression in Sephardic Jewish music. As for the Gitanos, I have no ancestral connection that I know of, but I do find flamenco music intoxicating. And I have a deep appreciation for the Gitanos' heart and soul preservation of a traumatic memory in parts of their music. So, first I'll talk about flamenco, the Gitanos, and the Jews, and then I'll play some music for you. Flamenco. The The Spanish musical tradition, known for its fiery guitar playing, emotional singing, and expressive dancing with lots of foot stomping and hand clapping, was recognized in 2010 by UNESCO as a World Cultural Treasure of Spain. Now, this designation is a bit ironic because it isn't really clear that flamenco's origins are truly Spanish. Flamenco was born, nurtured, and has been fiercely protected by the Roma people, who migrated west out of northwest India through Pakistan and Persia 1,000 years or more, eventually arriving in Europe. Those who migrated onto the Iberian Peninsula, now Spain and Portugal, and especially to the southern part of the peninsula called Andalusia, were called Gitanos, the Gypsies, and flamenco is their invention. The Roma rarely assimilated into the cultures they passed through, but they infused their own culture with artifacts that they picked up along the way: language, art, music. They tended to live on the edges of society and were often poor and persecuted. Interestingly, the flamenco culture that came out of Andalusia was actually spurned by the cultural elite of Spain as decidedly lowbrow, music of the back streets and alleys. And that attitude continued well into the 20th century until the Spanish government recognized the value of flamenco as a tourist attraction. I'm not making this up. Meanwhile, the Gitanos have fiercely protected their flamenco culture, and especially the songs which they sing with deep emotion and gravitas. The flamenco that we know today with guitar and dance is relatively new, only a couple of 100 years, but there is a Gitano cultural tradition of poetry and singing that's hundreds of years older. And you hear this older flamenco tradition in the so-called deep songs or Cante Jondo of flamenco. These very emotional songs have themes of trauma, loss, suffering, and death. And they're thought to date back to at least the second half of the 15th century. And it's these Cante Jondo that are at the center of the story about the historical interplay between Gitano and Jewish communities in Spain. Historians don't agree about exactly when the Roma migrated into Andalusia, and this matters for the story that I want to tell. In one narrative, the Romani came across the Mediterranean from North Africa around the 8th or 9th century, following the Muslim forces who conquered the Iberian Peninsula around that time. In the other narrative, the Romani arrived in Andalusia from Northern Europe in the mid to late 15th century, at the tail end of Muslim rule, just in time for the Inquisition and the Reconquista by Christian forces in the late 15th century. It's even possible that both migration narratives are true and that the Roma migrated in waves and from two directions. Meanwhile, by the 15th century, Jews had been living in the Iberian Peninsula for at least 1,000 years. And the two narratives about Roma migration have very different implications for the interactions between the two communities. And we'll see that both of these narratives can be traced through the Cante Jondo, the deep song of flamenco. So in the first narrative, where the Roma migrated from North Africa in the 8th to 9th centuries, their communities and the Jewish communities in Andalusia would have coexisted for centuries as minority cultures, each well aware of the other's traditions, their life cycle events, their music, and so on. Cultural melding would have been natural and gradual in this context, and over time, we might expect to see fairly recognizable bits of one community's musical culture reflected in the others. In the second narrative, the Roma arrived some 700 years later in the 15th century, a time of tremendous social and political upheaval in Spain. They would have known nothing of the more or less peaceful coexistence between Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities that existed under centuries of Muslim rule. Instead, they would have observed the Reconquista, perhaps with a sense of horror, even familiarity. As ancient Jewish communities in Andalusia collapsed, traumatized people were being horribly persecuted, facing death if they didn't either convert or leave Spain. The Gitanos embraced Catholicism, but remained an underclass. Most Jews and Muslims left in a hurry in 1492. A few stayed, and a few of those converted and embraced their new faith. Others converted outwardly, but secretly stayed faithful to their ancestral religions. Still others went into hiding in mountainside caves where it was too treacherous for the authorities to come after them. The implication of all this is that in the years immediately following 1492, the Gitanos might well have been traumatized by what they had borne witness to. Certainly, they would have wandered through abandoned neighborhoods and synagogues. And over the years, the Jews would have become the stuff of legends and stories, often not terribly flattering. In this context, we might expect to see songs that reflect stories and legends and myths rather than anything recognizable. Most ethnomusicologists believe that the culture of flamenco was born out of these traumatic circumstances. From this perspective, flamenco's Cante Jondo emerged as medieval lamentations, very much in the biblical mode, a cry of pain, grief, and longing, a voice of protest from the social outcast groups who didn't fit the political order. The Gitanos have fiercely protected this historical memory in these lamentations for 500 years. A poetic interlude from a poem of the deep song by Federico Garcia Lorca. Upon a barren hill, a Calvary, clear water, and century-old olive trees. In narrow streets, men hidden under cloaks, and on the towers, the spinning vanes forever spinning. O village lost in the Andalusia of tears. Wow. So, here is a little description of Jewish cultural practices as they might be remembered in Andalusia if the Gitanos and Jews had been in close proximity for centuries. We're in medieval Spain. Jewish communities are going about their business. with some decades and even centuries being better for them than others depending on where in Spain and who's in charge. The men go to synagogue where they pray and read from the Torah. Women are barred from reading from the scrolls and from any ritual leadership in the synagogue, but they're not without ritual roles in the community. One of the ritual roles of women in the Jewish community is around death and dying. They tend to the sick, reciting psalms, and when death comes, they're part of the funeral procession, walking through the streets, crying, wailing, singing psalms and lamentations in the distinctly mournful synagogue chanting style that they know but are forbidden from practicing in the synagogue itself. There's even a history of Jewish women hiring themselves out as professional wailers for others' funerals. Fast forward a millennia. Today, there is a fascinating prayer tradition known as Saeta in southern Spain during Holy Week that seems to hearken back to this ancient Jewish funeral practice. The Saeta are deep, mournful prayers of grief for the crucified Jesus. During Holy Week, there are funeral-like processions through the streets, sometimes even carrying enshrouded statues of Jesus. Periodically, the procession stops while someone sings a mournful lament. Originally, the Saeta were Gregorian psalms sung within the monastery, but eventually the Saeta became more public and were adapted for singing in the streets. Some historians believe that the early street singers of Saeta might actually have been conversos, the Jews who converted to Catholicism to avoid prosecution. Eager to prove the sincerity of their new faith, these singers chanted the Saeta with intense passion, using what they knew, a style of chanting that would have sounded more than vaguely familiar to Jews experienced in synagogue worship during the very most solemn of ritual observances, such as Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, or reading from the Book of Lamentations, commemorating the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. The Gitanos, in time, also embraced this style of singing Saeta in the streets, and today many of the most popular singers of Holy Week Saeta are Gitanos flamencos. But they went beyond the Holy Week street singing, incorporating the passionate, mournful Saeta into their own Cante Jondo repertoire. It's as if the Gitanos were determined to preserve this historical memory of trauma and death. Some ethnomusicologists are convinced that there are Sephardic Jewish roots in both the modern-day version of Saeta and the flamenco Cante Jondo. But what if the Romani migration hadn't occurred until much later, and there'd been no sustained, centuries-long cultural contact between Gitanos and Sephardim? In that case, we might encounter a musical tradition like Peteneras, a Cante Jondo song reflecting stories, legends, and even stereotypes of an oppressed people. The Peteneras songs are especially intriguing because many of them contain direct or indirect allusions to the Jews. Peteneras is so closely associated with trauma and suffering and death that some Gitanos are reluctant to perform it for fear of bad luck. There's even a story about a famous flamenco singer who died after singing Peteneras. So, Peteneras. La Petenera refers to a beautiful, independent, unattainable woman. A bit of a femme fatale, perhaps? Some versions of the song are explicitly about a Jewish woman, while others sing of a funeral procession in the streets so full of wailing mourners that no one can move. Does that sound familiar? In one story, the Petenera is the reincarnation of Lilith, the mythical first wife of Adam in the Garden of Eden. According to legend, Lilith would not be submissive. She wanted to be on top. And for this outrage, she was banished from the garden. Wounded and enraged, Lilith was out for revenge. She became a demon, literally, and the bane of all men and their wives. She entered homes, had sex with the husbands, birthed demon babies, and sometimes ate the babies. Not only that, she caused the wives to have miscarriages when they conceived. As the legend goes, Lilith moved to Spain with the Jews who went there in antiquity. And there she transformed herself into La Petenera, rampantly seducing, abandoning, and murdering many lovers, shape-shifting from a beautiful prostitute to a virgin, and yes, to an angry Jewish woman out to avenge the fate of her people, to whom she remained loyal in spite of her rage and exile. In another version, La Petenera is a Sephardic woman whose prominent Jewish family had lived in Spain for over 800 years. Rather than leave in 1492, she converted to Christianity to protect herself, but inwardly she held fast to her Jewish convictions. Being beautiful and wealthy, La Petenera was the object of many men's passions, but she refused her suitors, never marrying or taking lovers because doing so might have betrayed her beliefs. Those who couldn't have her were often spiritually destroyed. Ultimately, La Petenera in this story was murdered by a jealous suitor who decided that if he couldn't have her, then no one could. Pretty intense stuff. So I'm going to play you a stylized instrumental version of the Peteneras by the well-known flamenco artist Paco Pena. I'll embed within the instrumental two sung verses from the Peteneras Cante Jondo, as well as a medieval Sephardic lamentation called Una Yo Naci, that shares a hauntingly familiar melodic motif with Peteneras. Some think that Una Yo Naci might even be part of the source material for Peteneras. Taken together, the verses I'll sing are about a challenging life. The poet laments about growing up too fast, about being harassed, about longing for love, and about dying. The verses say, "Where are you going, beautiful Jewess? I'm going to find Rebecca, who's in the synagogue. At 1, I was born. At 2, I grew up. At 3, I took a lover. At 4, I was married. The Petenera has died. They take her to be buried. There's no room in the street for all those she left behind. Laura said something to me this afternoon that was very helpful. I'm very nervous about playing this piece. It's probably the most complicated piece I've ever learned. And she said, well, think about the Persian tradition of rug making, where they deliberately insert into every rug they make an error. I've inserted a few errors. Donde va bella Judea, tan compuesta y al deshora, voy en busca de Rebeca, que está en la sinagoga. Voy en busca de Rebeca, que está en la sinagoga. A la una yo nací, a los dos me engrandecí, a los tres tomé amante, a los cuatro me casé, a los tres tomé amante, a los cuatro me casé. La Peteneras se ha muerto, ya la lleva a enterrar, y no cabe por las calles la gente que va detrás. La Peteneras se ha muerto, ya la lleva a enterrar. A la una yo nací, a los dos me engrandecí, a los tres tomé amante, y a los cuatro me casé. A los tres tomé amante, a los cuatro me casé. I would love to invite my beloved and singing partner to join me in another piece of music. This is a very, very famous Sephardic love song.
Charles has gently pressured me to join him for one last song. Let me introduce the song. The traditions and the backstory of La Petenera are filled with some very upsetting and violent images of women and possibly some anti-Semitic imagery, but this song is quite different. This song is more in the tradition of the coded protest songs. It's probably what we would say number 2 on the Sephardi hit parade, a very well-known song in Jewish circles from Sephardi traditions. The words are in the language of Ladino, which is sometimes called Judeo-Spanish, or sometimes it's even called Judeo-Arabic, though I'm not sure why. That's a different language, Judeo-Spanish. And the surface meaning of the song is a young person in love is pining away for their beloved. It's sung equally in contemporary times by men and women. The original composer is lost, and it's a universal sentiment. Under the surface meaning, as those of us who've studied the Song of Songs know, that love poetry addressed to a human can also be addressed to God. The under the surface meaning of this song is a prayer to the Holy One to remember us and bring us to safety.
Sweet.
Oh, I forgot to translate the words.
Oh.
Sorry, I forgot to translate the words. The words mean something like this. Nightingales sing with sighs of love, and they sing this song, my soul, my fate are in your hands. The rose blossoms in the month of May, but my soul suffers in the shadows of love. Come quickly, my dove, come quickly to me, run to me, my darling, and save me now. Los bilbelicos cantan con suspiros de amor. Los bilbelicos cantan con suspiros de amor. Mi neshama, mi ventura están en tu poder. Mi neshama, mi ventura están en tu poder. La rosa enflorece en el mes de mayo. La rosa enflorece en el mes de mayo. Mi neshama, mi escurece, sufriendo del amor. Mi neshama, mi ventura, sufriendo. 'Sufriendo del amor. 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 'Suf
Más presto ven, paloma, más presto ven conmigo. Más presto ven, paloma, más presto ven conmigo. Más presto ven, querida, corre, sálvame, 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 sálvame. Más presto ven, querida, corre, salva, sálvame.
Thank you, Laura.